race reaction to round 6, actually really round 4, the proper round of the 2026 FI Formula 1 World Championship, the calendar of which you can see in the beautiful scarlet red colors here to my left, here to my right. You can see it in this traditional, the championship winning black and golden colors. And in this reaction we will of course take a look at it from the perspective of me, Ferrari's biggest fans. And I think, speaking of all tifosi, what we really thought, what was really, pulsating, exciting, Miami Grand Prix, but which I believe also is, heavily edited or influenced, or kind of policed the Miami Grand Prix, which is not a surprise, being of course in the United States. But I have to say, the whole weekend, obviously you've already seen my sprint reaction, what I thought to our results. And, when we went to the qualifying, it was obviously important that we started, hopefully on the front row, get the first pole position of the season, or, to make sure that we are as close with both cars, not just obviously with Leclerc, to the front as possible, because I think by taking a lead on the evidence of the sprint, we would have been able, to win. And I have to say that pretty much for the first third of the race, if we did the same thing in the sprint, we would definitely be celebrating a victory after over a year of without a Ferrari victory, which I think will have a big repercussions and ramifications. So here in this race reaction, we will tell you everything about the race, how it panned out for us as Scuderia Ferrari, and why the results are frankly really disappointing. We will then turn around the Scuderia Red Regina iMac, and obviously you will see how the race finished, a far cry from obviously the double podium and my victory that I've gotten when I was driving with the SF1000 T818 Formula 1 racing simulator around Miami. I hope you enjoyed that great victory as I again perfected the second sprint weekend of the season. And here I have to say, this second sprint weekend of the season in real Formula 1 turned out to be a real disappointment, for us, especially bringing in new upgrades. But the fact that we probably, didn't do so well in the upgrade battle, maybe with the orange teams or the Red Bulls. But also, it's hard to tell, if it was the upgrades or really the updated directives. So we will take a look at it. That there are a lot of because if you go on the Formula 1 website, when you see how the race finished over here, there are a lot of penalties applied. So we obviously waited a little bit, with recording this race reaction, so that we can really tell you how exactly the race finished. And we will then take a look at the updated drivers and constructors standing. Mention a little bit. Definitely wish my amazing race in Miami in a great weather. As I obliterated the opposition, as I showed them who's the boss, who's the 4-time, soon to be 5-time, hopefully world champion for Scuderia Ferrari. So yeah, you can see that we haven't won a lot here in Miami, which is why even for me, I'm only sporting these two shiny golden Formula 1 Grand Prix winner trophies as a result. But for us as Scuderia Ferrari, having never won here, we really wanted to, win in Miami. And when Leclerc qualified third with, Antonelli grabbing a pole position over here, and obviously, doing something that only, Schumacher and Senna has done to get the first 3 pole positions, of their career, obviously joining very illustrious, club of real Formula 1 legends. You knew that he's onto something good, but we know that he has a poor start. With obviously, having first up of Red Bull, second, Hajar did qualify third in Australia, so it wasn't such a big surprise, but it was a big disappointment, to be honest, for us, because when we look at it, we definitely didn't want the Red Bull to be there, right? Verstappen kind of got lucky that he went at the end of the qualifying, so there was less win because none of the drivers have improved, and you would expect Leclerc maybe to extend Hamilton, jump Russell, that we would be again on the first 2 rows. As it ended up, we were on a row obviously second and third, with the third and sixth place, so a bit of an improvement from 4th and 7th as the orange cars faltered. So when then we were told that the race start was actually pushed 3 hours forward to almost the sprint starting time, because of the mandated law, which states that if there are thunderstorms, I believe within the radius of the 10 kilometers of where the sporting event is taking place, then it must be by law, it must be stopped, right? Because obviously everybody should seek the shelter. That is a little bit different to some of the other countries. Sometimes you see, like if you go down to Latin America, for example, they don't play even when there is a thunderstorm. So you just want to prevent any really low possibility of the lightning hitting, for example, anybody, right, who's outdoors. They are injuring the fastest cars in the world. So as a result, we wanted to avoid that, even though actually in the end maybe it wasn't necessary. But that also meant that it was going to be a dry race, which we would probably prefer. It would be interesting to see the cars obviously racing in the wet. But again, since normally the racing has been quite exciting, usually again in the rain it's a bit more dangerous. The track, you could see, like, you could aquaplane, even though the Formula 2 cars, if you watch the Formula 2 race, which we usually don't, they managed to race quite well in a wet, right? So it was raining in the morning, then it dry out around the 1 p.m. the local starting time. So big excitement, and we really wanted to see Leclerc leading into the turn 1 and then seeing what happens next. And yeah, he did a great job over here, really showing off the power of that Ferrari turbo as we easily went past Antonelli, but also Verstappen. And then what happened is that the boat, we called him like the old teenage and the young teenage, basically lock up the wheels, and Leclerc, obviously being a very smart, one of the smartest drivers, just waited for them to outbrake themselves, come out, go off the track, and then he took the lead. And Verstappen was really so trigger happy on the throttle that he spun in spectacular fashion while trying to keep up with Leclerc, which actually hammered Hamilton, because he had to go over the high curbs of the turn 3. Otherwise, he was onto of maybe P4, P3, and that would have been really, really critical for his race, because due to the, again, Verstappen, the worst driver, on a grid, again, causing the shenanigans over there, unlike Antonelli, who has, safely returned and actually kept the second place, which was really well done by him, considering he's 19 years old, right? He knew, okay, I was going to be outbreak like last season, for example, in the Miami sprint, where I think it was Piastri who kind of pushed him wide. So really great maturity from Antonelli to keep out. But for us, that start, that was very critical, because Hamilton was next to the Colapinto, who then, of course, Colapinto is kind of like, yes, he's gotten a great result here, but a lot of the times he seems average, sometimes a little bit clumsy and careless, and that clumsiness really showed when at the end of that back straight, for example, he pretty much with his, spin up the rears, big hit, to Hamilton's cars, who that definitely then wasn't, in the best condition. But when there was a safety car, a little bit later on, when Hajar inexplicably cleared the barrier, going over the crest and underneath, obviously, that highway overpass, we didn't stop Hamilton, which I think maybe would have been a better option, to simply draw him in the back, but try to repair the car. Again, hard to see if the car could have been repaired though, right? So we don't have the exact information on that, but definitely that hammered Hamilton, who was running in P6, but Leclerc was leading and doing very well, defending from Antonelli, then repassing him, also being able to keep Norris behind. So when the safety car, came out, obviously we stayed out, right? And then surprisingly, everybody started on the mediums. Surprisingly, once the safety car came out, Leclerc started to lose the spots, right? So first, it was Norris actually who went past, then Antonelli. But Leclerc was able to keep up. And then I think the critical thing happened in a race, which is where George Russell has managed to stop. And Russell obviously fighting for a championship, not wanting his young teammate to win, even though Antonelli clearly had a measure of Russell last year here in Miami, and definitely this year. What they did was they went for an early pit stop, right? Usually everybody wanted to extend because there was the threat of the incoming rain, but the rain never really materialized. Maybe just little few drops here or there, kind of like the sprinkles. It had no effect. So you could really go, onto that hard tire a little bit earlier if you wanted to do the undercut. But in Miami, like if you watch, for example, my race, the tire degradation is not really an issue. So why to really copy Russell, or try to cover, as we say, Russell, when he was running pretty much in P5, right? As obviously he was behind and overtaken by Piastri at the race start. So to me that was a little bit weird, but it didn't trigger the pit stops of the other drivers, but crucially it drove us into traffic. I guess the thinking from the strategist was, okay, we will still be able to go past the drivers, but you have to use more of the tires, and critically, of course, you cannot go that fast, especially when you catch somebody like the Williamses, for example, going through some of the slower sections. That's half a second, 1 second gone, 3-5 times, until you basically clear all of the traffic, because we dropped to about P12, P11 And that pretty much meant that suddenly Leclerc was out of the fight, for the lead, even though we maybe could have extended the stint through this. And I think on the evidence of what happened at the end of the race, though, is that, our tire management wasn't that great, especially with Charles. Hamilton kind of kept up there. Red Bull, they were the only ones who, stopped during the safety car. So, they were for, very short, the first stint, and then very long 50-lap stint on the hard tires, which backfired spectacularly. We really love to see that. But then what you had is Leclerc actually passing Russell, because we were really faster. And, that's actually a critical move, because it could be Leclerc, against Russell for the championship, because you never know, what's going to happen. In Canada, we expect, it to be very similar to Australia. So again, maybe the orange cars will falter, and, it will be between, the Benz and us, Scuderia Ferrari, and of course, Monaco coming up, and it could again be a new championship, from Barcelona onwards. So, it was very important that we were able to beat the Mercedes-Benz, but not really having the orange cars over there, with especially Norris, but also Piastri, kind of disturbing the order, right? So for Leclerc, in the end, he was, able, of course, to claw back to fourth. Then the critical move in a race was that Mercedes stopped early, as Antonelli was running behind Norris, which allowed them to undercut, Norris, even though Antonelli brilliantly overtook Norris for the lead, just in front of the podium, with which he was celebrating. Obviously, the only driver to have won his first 3 Grand Prix over here, on the trot. Again, amazing achievement by a teenager, which gives him really a 100 rating of 100 points. But you can see, that once he was able to overtake Norris, who just on the cold tires couldn't keep up ahead, right, coming out of the pits. That was pretty much settled, because again, just like in the sprint, there was no overtaking. Once both Mercedes engines were against each other, Antonelli was able to keep up Norris, right? Leclerc, then gotten past Russell, and then Verstappen to the P3, and it looked quite good. But then when Piastri cleared Russell after the fight, he was able to claw back to Leclerc, and then I think we can jump right to the end of the race. Big disappointment, I think, with what Charles did, and I can understand him, because with 2 laps to go, it really started to look like, look, Piastri is gonna get within the 1 second, and he could overtake us very potentially on the last lap. So what Leclerc did was, that he actually didn't turn on, or if there was a mechanical issue, we don't know, but obviously heading on that long straight towards the Hard Rock Stadium, he simply, didn't use the so-called rotating, that Macarena wing, right? And simply let Piastri through, because he wanted to get the overtake mode. And while I can understand that, I was like, is Piastri really that close to you? Or, again, it wasn't that clear if that was a really smart choice. In any ways, he pretty much lost it coming out, of the section, when he probably just wanted to put down the power, but got, a bit of a wheel spin heading into the final chicane, and that meant that obviously, he had to stay, within a second of Piastri, or, as close to him as possible, so that, on the next 2 overtaking opportunities, right, at the end of the back straight and at the end of that final straight heading into the Hard Rock Stadium, we could actually overtake him. But what happened was very spectacular, right? So we knew, you could always watch that, the McLarens, they deployed their battery going around the Hard Rock Stadium, right? So especially from turn 1, 2, 3, 4. So Leclerc obviously wanted to use a bit more power there. Why? To make sure that the Piastri doesn't, pull up another, 2 or 3 tenths, which could be the difference then between him losing, effectively giving up the podium. So what did he do? Went on the power more, and of course spun in a spectacular fashion, and hit the ball a little bit, right? And you could see, like, when Hamilton got hit by Colapinto, it did have an effect, but didn't affect, I believe, the steering. With Leclerc, he was obviously complaining about the steering, but he was able, I would say, to steer just fine. There was not, any imminent suspension failure, but obviously he was quite concerned, because it was still a big wag with the wall. But the car was just okay, he just spun and pretty much, then just bounced off the wall. But what happened was that, Leclerc didn't, take any of the corners, at the full speed, and was unable to go through, I believe, 4 corners in total. But he had a lead of over almost 15 seconds to Russell. So I was like, come on, at least keep up the P4, because everything matters for a championship. But no, on the final straight, even touch with George Russell, they were able to overtake us. Then Verstappen, basically was able to get past the stricken Ferrari that clearly did have some steering issues, through the final chicane. That was very disappointing. But what was even more disappointing, which we are getting, to that first point that we mentioned, was the fact that, the FIA then decided for every, cut and corner, so 4 of them, so for every corner cut, there would be a 5-second penalty. So Leclerc got a 20-second penalty, which drops him then from a relatively okay-ish P6. I mean, at least not terrible, to P8, even behind Colapinto, who, did a great job in this race, to kind of stay, about 10 plus seconds behind Hamilton. And, it obviously then promoted Lewis to the 6th place. Verstappen has also gotten a penalty. That was another very controversial part, where he clearly went over the wide lane on the pit exit. But, it's a slam dunk, just like speeding in a pit lane, you should get a penalty for that. But no, the FIA did not penalize Verstappen, I guess, because he was just, driving like crazy, obviously, touching with almost everybody, including Russell, who, of course, got him at the end of the race, as Verstappen was on a 50-lap all tires, and there was a touch, so Russell had a damaged wing. Again, they had to have a contact. I mean, I really don't understand, why the protection, because he's clearly by far the most dangerous driver. And if you look at Andrea Kimi Antonelli, the way he races, at a very tender age of 19, this is exactly how it should be, unlike Verstappen, who crashes to everybody, right? So despite that penalty, though, it didn't promote Hamilton to P5, which, would have been good for us. But yeah, as a result, it went pretty much from, almost a perfect start, for Leclerc, and if Verstappen spun the other way, that could have been 1-3, potentially 1-2 for Ferrari, and maybe we could have been hearing that Italian national anthem here for just like we were still hearing the Italian national anthem, but we wouldn't start the podium celebration with it. We would end with it because Scuderia Ferrari would win, right? Exactly. So now let me turn around the Scuderia Red Retina iMac. So this is how the race finished. So Miami Grand Prix, very disappointing, and it will have repercussions over here, I believe. So let's take a look at it. So Andrea Kimi Antonelli, again, a superb job here, winning 3rd out of the 4th real Grand Prix that we ran so far. In the end, he shook off the reigning champion Norris on the upgraded, much improved McLaren for the victory. 3rd, then Oscar Piastri, who, Leclerc let him go. I believe that was, Leclerc sometimes maybe tries to be too smart over here, but he needs to understand, you won 8 races. Sometimes, you just defend really, really hard on that final lap, right? You don't just, let them, go past you, right? You can go late on the brakes, kind of maybe like Verstappen, I would say, but, basically still in a control manner, instead of just letting them go, and now you're behind, and now can you make the move? That's a big question, right? Piastri finished there. Russell then in the end 4th. Verstappen will keep that 5th place, but obviously 5 seconds added to his time, and Leclerc dropping from 6th to 8th because 20 seconds, that's very harsh, I would say, and I don't like when the FIA does it. I mean, you have to understand, if the car was really damaged, the last thing you want is to apply the full power, go through, like, for example, the Miami Marina, where I'm mega, right, and then find out that the car doesn't turn in and you're in the wall. Of course, another argument is that Leclerc could simply slow down, take every corner slowly, because the car was still able to turn. But still, it's just, it's additional 4 points, that the FIA maybe didn't need to give such a harsh penalty. 5 seconds would have been enough. It meant that it promoted Hamilton to 6, also Colapinto to 7, 9 then for Carlos Sainz, 10 for Alexander Albon. They had their big fight with Verstappen when he obviously dropped back after the spin. Very, very unfair to both of his former teammates, I have to say. And it's funny that the driving standards like this are pretty much okay. But this is very key though. If you look at it, apart from us and the Red Bull, all the other 7 cars powered by the Mercedes engines. So the directive that we talk about clearly benefited, certain manufacturer, right? Even though you have the upgrades, you have to say the Hasses, they would be very strong, but now suddenly Williams is there, right? So, on one hand, we do understand that, yes, there are things to be tweaked, but these are the regulations. So just like when you have the rules, you don't want to be, you don't want to keep on changing them, right? Because now, anybody who's not using the Mercedes engine might feel, compelled, right, to have the rules change again and again, and that can have a big effect on how the championship would look like. So why not just keep, the right set of the rules, let everybody work very hard to catch up. We have a great token system which obviously benefits the teams that are at the back, kind of like with the NBA draft or NHL draft. Like, this is what I think the American sports do very well. But if you are not performing well, we will allow you to take the best youngest players, right, or to upgrade your car more than the first team. So I think that's working very well. Sometimes patience is more necessary than just let's make any adjustment so that basically everybody is happy. But now such a big gains by McLaren and Red Bull, I don't recall that the teams would be half a minute, 1 minute behind on the race pace, and then they would be able to claw back so much of a performance. Again though, Miami is quite a special circuit. We absolutely love it. So we will see what happens in Canada, but really it's not until we get to Barcelona, which is a proper racetrack, obviously used also for the testing, that we will know the effect of the directives. But yeah, if it's like this way, the heads can fall at Ferrari, because we sacrificed the majority of the 2025 season to be competitive, and now 6th and 8th, that's terrible. Heading into Canada, we expected more from Miami than from Canada, because even though Hamilton is strong, I believe in Canada Leclerc is none. If it's going to be raining, yeah, let's see what we can get there. It will be important to get through this period. The Monaco is less than a month away now. And from there, that could be, a really big push for the title, but it's important not to lose the points. Leclerc could have had 15 points, ended up with 4. And that's all basically on him. And he's a great guy. Again, he would admit that, but you're fighting for a championship now. You've beaten Russell. We will see what happens with Antonelli. Is a big question mark. It's great to see him doing so well, but I'm just really disappointed, and also with the directives and everything. Yeah, it basically kind of creates a situation where if you complain, okay, we will, increase, the energy output, so that, the other teams that maybe didn't do such a good job according to the original regulation can do better. Just like, why do we have to wait for so long at the start? Just speed up the turbo, figure it out, just like we did, for example, the McLaren. They were able to figure it out, but you see Mercedes, Red Bull, they are still like the snails of the line. So over here, that would be how the race finished in Miami. Again, big congratulations to Antonelli. And here we can then see how the 2025, 2020, 2026, 2026 Drivers' Championship looks like, with Andrea Kimi Antonelli 100 performance leading with 100 points. Then we have George Russell second, who is now on 80 points. And Canada is one of his favorite tracks, so that will be very interesting to see. Can he beat Antonelli there? Charles Leclerc, 59 points, staying behind, but now look at the gap, 41 points. Again, if he didn't make a mistake, that gap would have been only, you guessed it, 30 points. And now, reigning world champion Lando Norris for McLaren is 4th, 51 points. 5th, Lewis Hamilton for Scuderia Ferrari, 51 points. 6th, we then have Oscar Piastri, McLaren, 43 points. 7, Max Verstappen for Red Bull Racing over here, 26 points. 8, Oliver Berman has 17 points. Suddenly drop back a lot because they didn't get any points there. 9, Pierre Gasly, Alpine, 16 points. Thankfully walked away from his nasty accident. 10 is then Liam Lawson, Racing Bulls, 10 points. That was the driver who spun him around, rather unluckily. 11th is then Franco Colapinto, Alpine, 7 points. Great result for him, and that can help him to stay in Formula 1. 12 is then Arvid Lindbergh for Racing Bulls, 4 points. 13, Isaac Hadjar, Red Bull Racing, 4 points. Again, he made silly mistake in Australia last year. Here in Miami, hopefully he will do much better. It will be interesting to see what his potential is. 14 is then Carlos Sainz Williams, 4 points. 15, we have Gabriel Bortolotto Audi, 2 points. 16, Esteban Ocon Haas, 1 point. 17, Alexander Albon for Williams, getting his first points. And 18, Nico Hülkenberg, Audi, 0 points. Didn't even start a sprint. Again, Audi, having lots of issues over here, reliability-wise. So hopefully they can fix that out. 19 is, then Valtteri Bottas, Cadillac, 0 points. 20th, Sergio Perez, Cadillac, 0 points. 21st, Fernando Alonso, Aston Martin, 0 points. 22nd, how fittingly, Lance Stroll, Aston Martin, 0 points. So this is the Drivers' Championship. Now over here, Let's go to the Constructors' Championship. So you can see Mercedes-Benz leading with 180 points over here. And, we have gotten nicely over here to the 100 points. I believe we are, if I can see it correctly, over here on 110 points. But big gap now of 70 points. So that is definitely a disaster of a result. McLaren now third, 94 points, much closer to us than before. Fourth, Red Bull Racing, 30 points. Fifth, Alpine, 23 points. Definitely the Mercedes engine is helping them. Sixth, Haas, 18 points. Seven, Racing Bulls, 14 points. 8, Williams, 5 points. 9, Audi, 2 points. 10, Cadillac, 0 points. 11, Aston Martin, 0 points. So this is the constructors table for the 2026-2026 season. This is the drivers table for the 2026-2026 season. And the 2026-2026 Miami Grand Prix finish with Andrea Kimi Antonelli. Clearly showing everybody, that he wants to have that first championship by a teenager. Never happened in Formula 1. Would be by far the youngest ever winner of the Formula 1 World Drivers' Championship. So, big disappointment for us as Scuderia Ferrari fans, but you could enjoy, a perfect Miami Spring Grand Prix weekend. Bayern, the Svaliksan champion, obviously winning the Spring, winning the Grand Prix, really making that one-stop strategy war, driving like a champion. I have to say, I love this circuit, and what a pity we as Ferrari didn't do better, but hey, in May now we again have almost 3 weeks, right? The next 2 weekends we won't be racing. We go to Canada at the end of May. On that should be the 24th. So definitely we will see what happens over there, and we really have to develop that car, because if not, I guess that move from the team principal Andrea Stella, the former Michael Schumacher's engineer, will really go to Ferrari, because McLaren improved much more than we did. That in-season development will be crucial if we can finally win the constructors and especially the drivers' championship or not. So everybody, I hope you enjoyed this exclusive race reaction. Bayern, the Svaliksan champion, Ferrari's biggest fan, disappointed on one front, but really celebrating over here, by driving like a champion, as I myself, we are marching towards my 5th Formula 1 Drivers' Championship for Ferrari, 6th obviously for the constructors. I am doing the 6th season now, so it's looking all rosy, and I hope it will be in a real life soon too. But hey, I can hear the tunes, there are still some celebrations. The sun is back. Let's jump into some swimming pools like around the Miami Marina to enjoy what Formula 1 really can be, a real tropical fun. We are loving it. We love Miami. We love racing. We love Formula 1. We love Ferrari. Forza Ferrari.